Wake up. It's the Sleep Unplugged podcast, episode 114, Inflammation and Sleep. I'm on fire. Welcome, everyone, to the Sleep Unplugged podcast. My name is Chris Winter. I'm a neurologist, sleep specialist, and your host for this episode of the podcast. If you're new to the Sleep Unplugged family, welcome. If you're a veteran, welcome back. We are glad you are here. Busy week. I was up in New York City and Vermont over the last 7 days, enjoying some of the best coffee, I think, in the world. First, I was up in Burlington, Vermont, and there's so many great coffee shops there. I can't even choose my favorite. Onyx Tonics, Cosmic Grind, August 1st, Black Cap, Scout. And I'm even wearing my crew t-shirt, which is right there on the sort of main street of Burlington. Really great coffee and really great people serving coffee with a lot of knowledge of what they're doing. Went from Vermont down to New York City, where I hit 787 Coffee, Pulley Coffee in Chelsea Market, and Solid State Coffee up in the West Upper West 70s. Really hard, great coffee, and appreciate their service. So busy week, exciting week, and really happy to be here talking about a topic that I think is extremely important, which is inflammation. And it really touches on other episodes that we've done. Episode 70 on injury, episode 48 on pain, even episode 35 on cardiovascular disease. We also did one on dementia. I mean, I think all of these things are fair game. And when you start really exploring the topic of inflammation, you see that it's sort of the common pathway for all of these disorders and more. So if you're interested in communicating with the show, you can via my Instagram. It's Dr. Chris Winter. You can follow me on Instagram and communicate through me through direct messaging. Also on Twitter, that's Dr. Chris Winter. We have a YouTube page where we post the videos of all of our content. You can interact through that platform as well. And we always have music that we talk about at the beginning of the show, and it's all featured on our Spotify playlist. And I posted a couple videos this week. Last week, our featured artist was Lana Del Rey, and I talked about her song and its relationship to a Leonard Cohen song that she did a response to, and was in New York City and happened to be walking by the Chelsea Hotel, snapped a picture of it, put it on Instagram, and a lot of you had some really cool comments about that. Just happened to be there, and there it was. So a lot of synchronicity for sure. We always start the show off with comments, corrections, and criticisms. This week is a comment from an individual named Alexandra. Alexandra wrote, "Hey, Dr. Winter, I became familiar and fascinated with your work via the Ologies podcast with Ali Ward. If you are a podcast listener and you're like, shoot, 20 minutes later, Chris's episode of Sleep Unplugged's over and I have to wait an entire week for another episode, here's a great podcast for you to listen to. Ali Ward. She interviewed me for a special double two-part episode about sleep. So she interviews ologists, biologists, and neurologists, somnologists, and does episodes about that. She did one on sleep. So she said, I wondered if you might have any thoughts about an experience of mine. My doctor recently recommended a magnesium supplement to manage distressing dreams that have been severely affecting her sleep. It's been about 4 days, and it seems like taking the magnesium has been a miracle. They have simply ceased for the time being. I can't recall a period of more than a night or two when I didn't experience vivid dreams. Are you familiar with this? Do you have any general thoughts about that? Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Alexandra, for reaching out. She did so via the Instagram page. And I'm excited that this is working for you. Magnesium does have some calming effects, can affect a lot of things related to sleep. People take magnesium as a sleep-related supplement. We've talked about that. We did an episode on supplements earlier on in the podcast. Do I think magnesium is going to cure all of your massive sleep woes? No, but as one of my mentors told me brains love magnesium. So taking it can be a very positive thing. What's interesting about this and why I featured Alexandra's question is that the more common side effect of taking magnesium is to actually increase dreaming. So if you're somebody who's taking magnesium for whatever reason, it's not uncommon for the dreaming to increase, not decrease. So I told Alexandra this information and said, hey, why don't you check in with the podcast as time passes? It's been 4 days. I would chalk that up to chance, but 4 days become 4 weeks, become 4 months. If it's happening that the magnesium is suppressing your dreams, that's great. I don't have a fantastic explanation for it, but I'm sure our listeners would love to hear your experience, Alexandra. So good luck to you. I hope I'm wrong and the magnesium continues to work for you, because having significant dreaming that happens over and over, unrelenting, unpleasant dreams, I think can be very, very distressing. And we did an episode on nightmare disorder. It was episode 97, Alexandra. So if the magnesium doesn't help, there is hope. Maybe listening to that episode could be useful. And speaking of upcoming episodes, we are going to, next week will be the Insomnia Monday, first Monday of the month. So we will do a topic related to insomnia. But the episode after that, we will be revisiting restless leg syndrome. We did restless leg early in the podcast. I believe it was episode 29. Let's see here. Restless leg. Restless leg syndrome, you gotta move. That was episode 13, way back in September of 2022. Our good buddy, friend of the podcast, Dr. Spector, is releasing a new updated book about restless leg syndrome. It launches on September 3rd. So if you just type in Andrew Spector and restless leg syndrome in your Amazon page, you can pre-order the book, and we'll do just a big book club. So not this week, or I'm sorry, not next week, but the week after. So that would be the 9th of September. We will do a podcast. And so everybody's going to read Dr. Spector's book on restless leg syndrome, and we're going to discuss it during the podcast. So before we jump into sleep and inflammation, the title of the podcast this week, Inflammation and Sleep, I'm on Fire. Most of you probably recognize the I'm on Fire song. It's Bruce Springsteen off of his massive, massive album, Born in the USA. Born in the USA was actually Bruce Springsteen's 6th album and was really the album that launched him into the stratosphere. I really think the golden age of Bruce Springsteen began with his 3rd album, Born to Run, which obviously Born to Run was a massive, massive hit. The album after that, Darkness on the Edge of Town, was his 4th album, which is one of my favorite albums of all time, and certainly one of my favorites of Bruce's. 5th album was The River, which we'll talk about in just a second. He kind of took a break from the E Street Band and recorded Nebraska, which is technically his 6th album, considered to be a masterpiece. I've never really fully been able to get into Nebraska, and then obviously that led into Born in the USA. His 6th album with the E Street Band, technically his 7th album. Recorded in New York City at Power Station Recording Studios, which in addition to seeing the Chelsea Hotel this over the last couple of days, I often stay in a particular hotel near Power Station and walk by. It's on West 53rd Street, right off of 10th Avenue. Very, very important studio. Scary Monsters, David Bowie recorded there. Also Let's Dance. Bruce Springsteen recorded The River there in 1980 and came back and recorded Born in the USA there. And the song I'm on Fire was actually recorded at Power Station. Very impromptu sort of song. He was sitting there kind of playing around with the lyrics. his drummer kind of joined in, and a keyboard player. And it's a significant song for Bruce because it's really one of the first Bruce Springsteen songs that actually features a synthesizer, not a common song that he plays in concert. In fact, when he started touring Born in the USA, he really didn't play that song. But as the tour went on, he started to kind of add it in, and it's sort of come and gone from his set list over the years. And often, when he plays the song, he sort of leads into it. He kind of introduces the band, talks about growing up, not being able to sleep when he was young because the house was too cold. They couldn't afford to heat it. And often that sort of leads into this sort of intense, kind of dark song, I'm on Fire. Speaking of Power Station, I always thought it was interesting, the Power Station. There was a group, Power Station, which was sort of a super group. It featured Tony Thompson of Chic, Andy and Roger Taylor of Duran Duran. A little fun fact, none of the three Taylors in Duran Duran were actually related, which I always thought was interesting. I always thought they were brothers, had no relation to each other whatsoever. So the two Taylors, Chic, Tony Thompson of Chic, and Robert Palmer recorded the album Power Station. It was sort of a super group, Get It On, Bang a Gong. I can't remember the other song was that was really big. But Robert Palmer was not supposed to be the lead singer. They were going to have lots of different lead singers on the album. He showed up to record his song, and he ended up recording Get It, Bang a Gong, Get It On. And they liked him so much that they recorded. But before they even could tour the album, Robert Palmer went on to record, I think, Riptide, and so it never really materialized. But all that happened at Power Station. So big studio, big album for Bruce. Again, this was the album that kind of launched him into the superstardom. But if you're not really familiar with Bruce Springsteen, Darkness at the Edge of Town is fantastic. And The River, which had the song Hungry Heart, which is probably one of my favorite songs ever, was on that as well too. And if you listen to Bleachers, that group, and I'm blanking on the lead singer of Bleachers' name, but he was actually the producer of Lana Del Rey's album that we talked about last week. Really has a lot of Bruce and Hungry Heart in his latest album, if you listen to it. But anyway, we digress. Moving on to sleep and inflammation. Sleep and inflammation is fascinating because there's beginning to be a relationship understood between sleep and inflammation that is very reciprocal. So when you think about the central nervous system and sleep and the immune system, it's basically shown that there's sort of a two-way relationship that's happening here, that sleep and the immune system definitely are enhancing one another, and that the signals from the immune cells promote better sleep. And when we have better sleep, we enhance our immune system and suppress our aberrant inflammatory responses. And there was a great 2023 article entitled Sleep and Inflammation, Bidirectional Relationship. And I'm going to read a little bit from that. Sleep and inflammatory cytokines have a bidirectional relationship where circadian rhythms influence levels of certain cytokines. And cytokines are just chemicals that serve an inflammatory immune system agenda. And so they are positive, but unusual or aberrant, abnormal increases in these can be negative. We want, our immune system needs to be finely tuned. We have inflammation that we are dealing with on a day-to-day basis, but we don't want that inflammatory response to be overwhelming, nor do we want it to be absent. So it causes an increase in levels of certain cytokines, and in return, some cytokines influence sleep, as we frequently experience during illness. What happens when we get sick? We want to sleep. So when we get sick, we have a response and an increase in these inflammatory markers and cytokines, which tend to produce the feeling of wanting to sleep. And there's been thoughts that could this unusual, abnormal increase of cytokines be responsible for people who have hypersomnia conditions, chronic fatigue syndrome, that this is a response to an immune system that's revved up for no real reason. The most common studied cytokines in the context of inflammation and sleep are interleukin 6, which we often call IL-6, tumor necrosis factor, which we often call TNF, and interleukin 1. In this article, the author follows the effect of circadian rhythms on blood levels of these cytokines and explores the changes in their levels in conditions that affect sleep, such as obstructive sleep apnea and insomnia. So the connection here is this. If we have something like sleep apnea that's influencing negatively the quality of our sleep, could that chronic sleep apnea be affecting our immune system and opening up a window through which disorders that we don't want to have can walk through? And so one mechanism that sleep is proposed to do this is provided some sort of like a survival advantage in terms of an immune system that might anticipate injury and infectious threats. However, in our modern times with 24-hour news cycles that are communicating with you specifically about all the things that cause you anxiety and stress, you're getting messages directed into your mailbox from Rachel Maddow that are creating a lot of anxiety, that Christian nationalism is rising and the threat of the unchecked conservative party is going to, all these things, if you're on the other side of the spectrum, could be causing you a lot of anxiety over a period of time. And that these chronic social threats could drive the development of not only sleep disturbances in humans, but also chronic inflammatory disorders. We're never getting a break from the inflammation. And that could be contributing to not only problems with inflammation, but also immune system functioning, opening up ourselves to cardiovascular threat, immune system threat. The list goes on and on. So again, what is the cytokine response? So the cytokine, we've talked about the interleukins and tumor necrosis factors. Cytokines are neuroendocrine proteins and chemicals that are produced to allow the immune system and inflammatory system to work. They interact very specifically with autonomic pathways that connect sleep with the immune system. And the role of these inflammatory peptides have not only roles to play with our immune system functioning, but also with the homeostatic regulation of sleep. So when you look at individuals who are chronically sleep deprived, like an individual who might have sleep apnea or have a lot of anxiety and strife about their sleep, as we see in individuals with insomnia, we could be creating inflammatory pathways beyond just the consequences of not getting enough sleep. So again, what are these cytokines doing and what are the responses that they're having in relationship to sleep? A fantastic article. I don't remember the date, but the title article was Sleep Disturbance, Sleep Duration, and Inflammation, a systematic review and meta-analysis of cohort studies in experimental sleep deprivation. So basically, they looked at 72 studies, over 50,000 subjects in these studies, and they were looking at not only the cytokines we talked about as interleukin 6 and tumor necrosis factor, but also another protein we referred to as C-reactive protein, was a protein produced in the liver in response to inflammation. So it's a bit more downstream. Inflammation happens, interleukins and tumor necrosis factors and things are happening, these cytokine response. And as part of that response, the liver releases this C-reactive protein. And it's a pretty common lab test that doctors do. It's common in the emergency room to see if something has happened related to an acute inflammatory response, something you might see in an individual who maybe has had a heart attack, or if you're concerned about some sort of clot or some sort of immediate situation, a C-reactive protein might be looked at. Also, in terms of inflammatory markers, if you're looking for arthritis or lupus or things of that nature, sometimes C-reactive proteins are part of those testing batteries. So they looked at individuals in these studies, analyzed these three factors: the C-reactive protein, interleukin-6, and tumor necrosis factor. And what they found was really interesting. So for individuals who have sleep disturbances, noisy bed partner, sleep apnea, I would throw shift work in there because it's disturbing the pattern, the natural pattern of, a set schedule and sleep, that individuals who had sleep disturbances had higher levels of both C-reactive protein and interleukin-6 versus normal controls. So disturbing sleep can increase inflammatory markers and by proxy, the inflammatory response. Shorter sleep duration was looked at as well too. So you're on a wonderful schedule. You go to bed every night at 3 and you're up at 6:30. So schedule is not a problem. You have no sleep apnea. Everything about those 3.5 hours of sleep are positive, except for the fact that the duration is simply not enough. This is what we would refer to as sleep deprivation. So individuals with shorter sleep deprivation, but not extreme short sleep. So you're somebody who requires 7 hours of sleep, you're getting 5.5, not 30 minutes. So it's that area we often talk about where, as long as I get my 5 hours of sleep, Chris, I'm fine. No, you're able to do what you need to do the next day. But if we peer deep into your chemistry, what we're going to find is that you're going to have higher levels of that C-reactive protein. But in this retrospective study, it didn't seem to affect the interleukin-6. So we're having this inflammatory response with the C-reactive protein, but interleukin-6 levels seem to remain steady. So this kind of goes back to a question I always get asked, and I don't really know the answer definitively, which is, what would you rather me do? Get 4.5 hours of sleep every night on a perfect schedule, or get 8 hours, 7 hours, 8 hours of sleep every night, but my schedule is constantly changing. I work 7A to 7P for a week, then 7P to 7A for a week. And I'm great at getting sleep. That shift of schedule doesn't affect me. This study might indicate that the sleep disturbances might be worse than the shorter sleep duration that's relatively scheduled and steady, which, again, this is all speculation. Wouldn't quote me on that. The next one, which was really interesting, they looked at was extremely long sleep deprivation. Chris, I only feel my best if I'm getting 15 hours of sleep at night. That was associated again with higher levels of C-reactive protein, higher levels of interleukin-6. And this goes back to the episode we did on sleep amount and the J curve. Remember, we talked about that. How much sleep do you really need to get? And that J curve is extremely important in the sense that we're looking for the right amount of sleep for that individual. As we start going low and entering in that realm of sleep deprivation, we start to increase risk, most likely through these inflammatory processes. But as we start to go high, the same thing happens as well too, where extremely high time spent sleeping or in bed can create that problem as well too, in terms of increasing inflammation and creating problems in that way as well too. So let's go back and revisit specifically sleep deprivation. So in the sleep deprivation, once again, we talked about this was causing higher levels of CRP, but not necessarily interleukin-6. This was not the case in a 2023 study entitled prolonged sleep deprivation induces a cytokine storm-like syndrome in mammals. Now, again, in the sleep deprivation that we looked at in that study, it was shorter sleep duration, but not extreme short sleep. So what happens when sleep is extremely shortened? So in this study, it was a study done on mice that were kept awake basically 96% of the time, which is awful. Think about a 24-hour day. I did not do the math. A good host would have done. What is 96% of 24 hours? My guess is it would be in the realm of minutes that you would be sleeping over a 24-hour period. After 4 days of exposure to these circumstances, these mice exhibited severe inflammation of virtually every marker, including interleukins and C-reactive protein and others. I don't remember what they were. And 80% of them would die. And this is what we talk about with you can't live without sleep, you can't live without water, you can't live without food, you can't live without air. So again, when somebody tells me, hey, you got to help me, I haven't slept in years, or I'm lucky if I get 1 hour of sleep. This is that kind of research that we're looking at here. As I look at this person who says this has been going on for years in their life, and they look okay, and they're not really taking any medication except for maybe a little bit of a medication for some anxiety or something like that, but they're not overweight, their hearts are not exploding, they're not showing these profound signs of inflammation, because this is an impossible situation. It's a situation that's not really compatible with life. So why do we care about this? Okay, so interleukin 6 is up and my C-reactive protein is high. Why do I really care about this? Well, inflammatory mechanisms contribute to all kinds of medical conditions. I mean, it might be the common denominator of everything. So when you're looking at C-reactive protein and interleukin 6 being high, these are massive predictors of cardiovascular disease. And as we said earlier, cardiovascular events. I one time was experiencing some strange pain in my chest, called up my buddy Anna Bear. She and I we were residents together at the University of Virginia. I went on to do neurology and sleep. Went on to do internal medicine and cardiology, but we were interns together. And I called her up, and, about 2 minutes into my explanation of what was going on, she said, Chris, are you going to sit here and talk to me about having chest pain? And we're going to entertain options that don't involve you going to get evaluated. Go to the emergency room or come to my office and get an EKG, and we got to check you out. Like, I'm not going to talk you out of doing that, even though your risk is very low. People with low risk have problems and die. So I went and got checked out. Everything was fine. What did they do for me? They did a standard EKG and ran some tests, including a C-reactive protein, which turned out to be normal. So it can be a marker for these types of events. Also a marker for hypertension. It's a marker for weight gain and obesity in older adults. It's a marker for type 2 diabetes. In fact, there was a study that I pulled up looking at inflammation and dementia, which I think is really something that is going to be much more looked at in the future. It was a 2019 study that linked inflammation and Alzheimer's disease. It was called Implications of Sleep Disturbance and Inflammation for Alzheimer's Disease Dementia. And when they look at individuals who are at risk for Alzheimer's, we know that chronic sleep deprivation is a risk factor for Alzheimer's. We also know that sleep, healthy sleep, engages that lymphatic pump that's pumping out beta amyloid, which is the chemical of plaques and tangles and things of that nature. But that underlying smoldering inflammation is what a lot of individuals think we need to be targeting when it comes to reducing population risk for dementia. How do we do that? How do we get better sleep? We exercise, we meditate, We eat a non-inflammatory diet. All these things that we know reduce the risk of having dementia going forward. And they just put out the things that we can do to reduce our risk for having dementia, reducing head injuries and eating, low inflammatory diet and exercise and concentrating on good sleep. These are things that are in our control, that when we're able to do that, even hearing, making sure that your hearing is good, all these things are in our control. And when we control for these variables, we can reduce our risk of not only dementia, but so many other chronic disorders that we see, which is why if you spent some time in my clinic, you would see a lot of individuals who have chronic inflammatory diseases that maybe I'm not responsible for treating as their sleep specialist, but in a way I am. We see a lot of this in sleep clinics because it goes hand in hand with poor sleep. So I really invite you to start thinking about sleep, start thinking about this podcast as ways to identify little tweaks that you can make in terms of your sleep that will make little tweaks in terms of your immune system. And I think back to episode 100 that we did, which was, 100 surprising tips, tricks, hacks, and secrets for amazing sleep. I mean, here's the secret. I don't think any one of those tips is going to radically change your life. No tip you read in a magazine or listen to a podcast is probably going to do it. But if you could make 100 little adjustments to your sleep that improve them just 1% or 2%, I do think that when you multiply that over time, we are greatly reducing our inflammatory burden and probably greatly reducing our risk for chronic disease in the future. So that's it. Inflammation and sleep done and dusted. If you have questions, comments, corrections, criticisms, get in touch with the show. Dr. Chris Winter Instagram, Dr. Chris Winter Twitter. You can find our video content on our YouTube page. If you're interested in the songs that we talk about on the show, we are now on the Spotify Sleep Unplugged Volume 3. You can find that on Spotify. Subscribe to that playlist and listen to all the songs we talked about on the show. Looking forward to next week and Insomnia Monday, and the week after, we will be discussing Dr. Andrew Spector's new book about restless leg syndrome. Find it on Amazon. I already have my copy. He was gracious enough to send me one autographed. It even mentioned the Sleep Unplugged podcast in the book. And so we'll be book clubbing that bad boy in 2 weeks. Hope you'll tune in with your copy. And until then, sleep well.